The knocking was not a sound. It was a weight against the door, a dead thud that had no echo, swallowed by the wind. The silence that followed was heavier than the blow. Inside, Cora did not move. Her golden retriever, Fen, lifted his head from the hearthstones, a low rumble building in his chest. The fire threw shadows that climbed the log walls, making the small cabin feel like the inside of a lung. Another thud, harder this time, a fist muffled by ice. Fen was on his feet now, the fur along his spine erect. The wind was a solid thing, a presence that pressed against the shuttered window and moaned down the stone chimney. It had been moaning for 6 days. Cora set down the needle and thread she was using to mend a leather glove. Her movements were deliberate, without wasted energy. She walked to the door, her hand resting on the iron latch. It was cold enough to steal the heat from her skin. She did not ask who was there. The wind answered all questions. She drew the bolt, the sound a sharp crack in the compressed silence, and pulled the heavy plank door inward. A figure stood there, more snow than man, a statue of frozen desperation. It was Mr. Davies, the rancher from the low valley. The wind tore at him, peeling back the layers of white to reveal a face raw and blistered with cold. His thick mustache was a solid block of ice. He tried to speak, but his lips were frozen together. His eyes, however, said everything. They were wide with a terror that had burned past pride. Behind him, the world was gone. Not dark, but a churning, blinding whiteness that had no top or bottom. It was everything and it was nothing. Cora stepped back, holding the door open just enough. Fen's growl did not cease. "The dog is fine," she said. Her voice was quiet, unused. It was the first time she had spoken to another person in a month. Davy stumbled inside, collapsing to his knees on the floorboards, bringing the storm in with him. He was not alone. Another man, the blacksmith Finn, followed, half carrying a third whose face was covered. They fell into the small cabin like felled trees, the door slamming shut behind them, cutting off the shriek of the world. The room was suddenly small, crowded with the smell of wet wool and fear. Cora looked at them, at the ice caked in their beards and the hollowed-out look in their eyes. She did not offer a blanket. She did not ask what had happened. She turned back to the fire, stoked it with a piece of dry pine, and put the kettle on the hook. The wind had not spoken of this in August. Then, the air was warm and smelled of dust and sun-baked pine. The streams ran low but clear. In the town, Mr. Hemlock at the mercantile polished his counter and spoke of a long, profitable autumn. The cattle belonging to Mr. Davies grew fat in the high pastures. But Cora saw different signs. She did not watch the sky for clouds, she watched the peakers on the scree slopes. They were frantic, their small bodies darting between rocks, mouths stuffed with grasses and fireweed. They were making hay twice as fast as the year before, building their winter stores with a desperate urgency. Her late husband had taught her to read such things. "Nature writes its own ledger," he used to say. "You just have to learn the script." She saw the geese leave a full 3 weeks early, not in scattered, lazy VS, but in a great, silent river flowing south, a dark current against the flawless blue. She felt it in her own bones, a deep ache that settled in her joints long before the first chill. Fen felt it too. The dog, usually content to sprawl in the sun, grew restless. He spent his days with his nose to the wind, his tail low, a quiet anxiety humming through him. He would follow her everywhere, his warm body a constant, worried pressure against her leg. She began her work. She took inventory of her larder, of the small, dry cave set into the granite rise behind her cabin. The numbers were not enough. She walked the 3 miles to town, Fen trotting at her heels. The dust from the road coated her boots and the hem of her dress. The town felt loud, complacent. Men laughed on the porch of the saloon, their voices confident and slow. She went into the mercantile. The air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and Mr. Hemlock's certainty. She placed her list on the counter. Flour, salt, lard, lamp oil. More than usual. Much more. Hemlock scanned it, one eyebrow raised. He was a man who measured the world in pounds and pence. His books were balanced. The weather was good. He saw no reason for alarm. "Stocking up for a siege, Cora?" he asked, his tone light with condescension. She did not answer the joke. "The winter will be early," she said. It was not a prediction. It was a statement of fact. "And it will be deep." Mr. Davies was in the mercantile, leaning against a barrel of nails, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that made the tins on the shelves vibrate. "Still listening to the squirrels, are we?" he said to the room at large. Several other men chuckled. Davies was a man whose confidence was his primary asset. His herd was the largest in the valley, his voice the loudest. He saw Cora's quiet warning as an affront to the established order of things, an order in which he was prosperous and the sun was shining. "The almanac calls for a mild season," he declared, as if he had consulted the book himself that very morning. "Good for the herd. Good for business." He looked pointedly at Hemlock, who nodded in agreement. The seasons were a matter of commerce, not superstition. Cora looked at the sacks of flour stacked against the far wall. "I will need 3 more, she said, her voice even. "And 20 pounds of salt." Hemlock stopped smiling. He turned the ledger on the counter toward him, running a finger down a column of figures next to her name. "Your credit is settled for the month," he said. "This is a significant new order." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I will need it to survive," she answered. Davies laughed again. "She's building an ark on a dry hill. Don't let her spook you, Hemlock." "The sky is clear as glass." The mercantile owner hesitated, his gaze shifting from Cora's unwavering expression to Davies's confident smirk. The choice was between a lone woman's strange assertion and the valley's most powerful rancher. It was not a difficult choice. "I'm afraid I can't extend that much credit on a feeling," Hemlock said, closing the ledger. The sound was final. Cora stood for a moment, the weight of their disbelief a physical thing in the room. She did not argue. She did not plead. She gathered the few items her cash could cover, her movements precise. The blacksmith, Finn, had been standing near the back, examining a set of horse bits. He had said nothing, but he had watched the entire exchange. As Cora turned to leave, his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. He looked away first, back to the metal in his hands, his silence a heavy cloak. She walked out into the unrelenting sun, Fenn pressing against her side, a silent, loyal shadow. The laughter from the mercantile followed her for a few steps before the wind carried it away. Her husband had dug the cave himself, not as a shelter but as a root cellar, a place to keep the harvest cool through the summer and protected from the first frosts. It was small, no bigger than her cabin's main room, with a low ceiling of solid granite. But it was dry. And it was defensible against the cold. She began the work that very afternoon. She did not have the credit for supplies, so she would pay with labor. She used the wheelbarrow to haul flat, heavy stones from the creek bed, one by one. The work was slow, her muscles burning with the effort. Fenn would lie nearby, watching, his head on his paws, occasionally whining softly as she strained to lift a particularly heavy rock. She was not building a wall of panic. She was solving a problem. The mouth of the cave was its weakness. She would narrow it, reinforce it, build a short, covered walkway that connected it directly to the back door of her cabin. She would make the cabin and the cave a single, sealed unit. Day after day, she worked. The sun beat down, and the townspeople, when they passed on the main track below, would sometimes stop and watch her. They saw a woman stacking rocks for no reason. They saw madness in her methodical labor. Her hands grew calloused, then split, but she worked on, mixing mud and straw to mortar the stones, creating a thick, insulating barrier. She chopped wood. Her husband had left behind a formidable woodpile, but she knew it would not be enough. She ventured farther into the forest, felling dead pines with his axe, the rhythmic thud of the blade against wood echoing in the quiet woods. She hauled the logs back, sectioned them, and stacked them until a new wall of firewood rose against the north side of her cabin, a bulwark against the wind they could not yet feel. She hunted, using the snares her husband had taught her to make. She brought back rabbits and grouse, which she skinned, salted, and hung to cure in the cool of the cave. Everything was a calculation. How much lamp oil per day? How many calories to survive? How much would to keep a fire burning for a month, or two? She was not hoarding. She was preparing. The world around her continued its placid, sun-drenched existence. Davies's cattle grazed peacefully. Hemlock's profits grew. Her labor was a silent, solitary argument against their peace, an argument they refused to hear. October arrived, and with it, a false autumn of impossible beauty. The aspens in the high country turned a shimmering gold, and the days were warm and still, the nights merely crisp. The valley settled into a deep, collective sigh of contentment. This, they all seemed to agree, was their reward for a year of hard work. This was the natural order. Cora's frantic preparations now looked not just foolish, but pitiable. Davies, holding court on the saloon porch, made her the subject of his jokes. Heard she's teaching that dog of hers to smoke fish, he'd say, and the men would roar with laughter. Probably thinks the creek's going to freeze to the bottom. Their laughter was a kind of fence, meant to keep uncomfortable ideas out. If she was wrong, they were all safe. Therefore, she had to be wrong. Hemlock, seeing his storeroom still full of the goods Cora had tried to buy, felt a smug satisfaction. His judgment had been sound. His ledger was the only almanac he needed. One afternoon, Finn the blacksmith came up the path to her cabin. He carried a shovel, its handle freshly repaired and oiled. He did not mention the mockery in town. He did not look at the wall of stone she had built or the mountain of wood she had stacked. He handed her the tool. The handle split. "Figured you might have use for it," he said, though she hadn't brought it to him. His eye scanned the horizon. "Still certain?" he asked, his voice low. It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging her reality. Cora did not need to answer with words. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady. It was enough. He nodded slowly, a deep unease settling in his broad shoulders. As he left, he set down a heavy burlap sack by her door. "Had some extra coal," he mumbled, not looking back. Taking up space, it was not a gift. It was an investment in a future he was too afraid to speak of, a quiet hedge against the confident laughter of the town. Cora carried the sack inside. It was another calculation entered into her private ledger, a measure of the first crack in the valley's solid wall of denial. The change did not creep in. It fell. On a Tuesday in mid-November, the valley awoke to the same mild, hazy sun it had known for weeks. By noon, the sky had turned to lead. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. A wind rose from the north, not in gusts, but as a single, sustained exhalation of ice. It had a different sound, a different feel from any autumn wind. It scoured the valley, stripping the last golden leaves from the aspens and carrying the scent of a vast and profound cold. The air grew thin, sharp in the lungs. Cora was outside, securing the last shutter, when she saw it. The horizon, which had been a clear line of distant peaks, was simply gone, erased by a low, advancing wall of grey. Fenn stood beside her, not barking, but whining low in his throat, his body pressed tight against her legs. The first flake of snow fell. It was not a flake. It was a pellet of ice, hard and dry, that clicked when it hit the wood of the porch. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the air was thick with them, a horizontal blizzard that did not drift down but flew parallel to the ground, driven by the immense power of the wind. In the town, there was a sudden, panicked flurry of activity. Men who had been sitting comfortably by the saloon stove were now scrambling to secure their homes, to find their livestock. Davies saddled his horse, his face a mask of disbelief, shouting orders to his ranch hands to ride to the high pastures and bring the herd down. It was too late. The cattle, miles away and exposed, would be caught in the open. Hemlock stood at the window of his mercantile, watching the world disappear. He saw the frantic, useless movements of the townspeople and felt the first cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. His ledger, with its neat columns and comforting balances, offered no protection from this. The numbers were wrong. The snow was no longer falling in pellets. It was a solid, churning mass, a river of white that engulfed everything. The world shrank to the walls of a person's own home, and then, as the cold began to seep through, it shrank to the space around their own body. The winter had not come early. It had arrived with the force of an execution. The storm was a living thing. For 7 days and 7 nights, it screamed. The wind was a physical force that shook the cabin to its foundations. Snow piled in drifts that buried the windows, plunging the small room into a perpetual twilight lit only by the flickering fire and a single oil lamp. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the wind and the relentless pressure of the cold. Inside, there was a strange, suspended peace. Cora moved with the quiet rhythm of survival. She portioned their food, a stew of salted meat and dried beans. She fed the fire, log by log, making each one last. She monitored the covered path to the cave, ensuring no snow blocked the way. Fen, who had been so agitated before the storm, was now utterly calm. He slept by the fire, his golden coat a patch of warmth in the dim light, his presence a steadying anchor. He knew they were safe. He trusted her preparations. She thought of the town, of the men who had laughed. She did not feel triumph. She felt a quiet, aching dread. She pictured Hemlock in his store, surrounded by goods he could not distribute, the cold seeping through his fine floorboards. She pictured Davies, his confidence stripped away, facing the loss of his entire livelihood, the source of his pride. She pictured Finn, the silent blacksmith, wondering if the small sack of coal he had given her had been enough for him and his own family. She did not know if they were alive or dead. The storm was an indifferent judge, and it had passed its sentence. On the 8th day, the wind lessened its assault. It did not stop, but its constant shriek dropped to a low, guttural moan. The snow was so deep that it pressed against the roof, making the timbers groan. Cora took the repaired shovel and cleared the snow from the door, a task that took over an hour. When she finally opened it, it was to a world remade, a landscape of alien shapes and impossible depths. Her cabin was a small hollow in a vast, white desert. The smoke rising from her chimney was the only sign of life for miles. There was no smoke rising from the town. There was only a profound and terrifying silence. The silence held for 2 more days. Cora and Fen lived in their small pocket of warmth, an island in an ocean of cold. She began to believe they were the only ones left. Then came the sound. The crunch of snow, laboured and slow. Fen heard it first, his ears perking up, a low growl starting in his throat. Cora stilled, listening. It was the sound of someone forcing their way through the immense drifts, fighting for every step. It was the sound of desperation. She went to the door just as the knocking came, the heavy, deadened thud of a fist that had lost all its strength. When she opened it, Davies was there, his face a ruin of frostbite and despair. Finn was with him, his own face grim, supporting another man who was barely conscious. They were the first refugees. She led them in without a word, the scene playing out as it had in her mind 1,000 times. She gave them stew. She gave them the warmth of her fire. Davies did not meet her eyes. He ate the stew in silence, the shame radiating from him a heat almost as strong as the fire's. He had lost everything. His herd was gone, buried somewhere under 15 feet of snow. 2 of his ranch hands were dead. His house was frozen, the roof collapsed. His pride was a frozen corpse alongside his cattle. "We saw your smoke," Finn said, his voice raspy. It was the only thing. We thought, maybe he didn't need to finish. Late that afternoon, more came. A small, huddled group led by the town's doctor, his medical bag useless against an enemy you couldn't diagnose or excise. He spoke of houses where the fires had gone out, of families huddled together under blankets, their breath turning to frost in the air. He spoke of the silence from the outlying homesteads. By nightfall, her small cabin held 12 people. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of fear and melting snow. The space was too small. The fire could not warm them all. They looked at her, their eyes asking the question they were too humbled to speak. She stood up and lit a second lantern. "This way," she said, and led them not outside, but to the back of the cabin, to the low door that led to the covered walkway. She opened the door to the walkway, a narrow tunnel of stone and wood that was dark and cold. A few of the townsfolk hesitated, a flicker of their old suspicion returning. A tunnel to a cave seemed like a tomb. But the cold at their backs was more terrifying than the darkness ahead. She led them through, the lantern light dancing on the rough stone walls. At the end of the passage was another heavy wooden door, insulated with packed straw and animal hide. She lifted the latch and pushed it open. The air that met them was not the dead, freezing air of the storm. It was cool, still, and dry. She stepped inside and lit the lamps she had placed along the walls. The soft, yellow light spread across the space, revealing not a damp hole in the ground, but a sanctuary. The cave was a room of rock, its walls lined with shelves she and her husband had built years ago. On those shelves were neat rows of glass jars filled with preserved vegetables. Slabs of salted meat hung from hooks. Sacks of flour, beans, and potatoes were stacked high against the far wall. There were barrels of water, tins of lard, and crates of lamp oil. In the center of the room, a small, efficient stove, its pipe vented through a natural fissure in the rock, was already laid with wood, ready to be lit. At the sight of the provisions, a collective sigh went through the group. It was the sound of a tension that had been held for days finally breaking. This was not luck. This was work. This was foresight. This was the truth they had laughed at, now stacked and measured and real. Mr. Hemlock was among the last group to arrive, his face grey with exhaustion. His fine coat was torn, his hands wrapped in rags. He, the man of ledgers and inventory, stood frozen at the entrance to the cave. He scanned the shelves, his eyes moving with the practiced efficiency of a merchant. He was not seeing food. He was seeing a different kind of accounting, one that measured life not in dollars, but in days. He saw the sacks of flour he had refused her, the tins of oil, the pounds of salt. It was all here. He looked at Cora, who was quietly organizing blankets. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. There was nothing to say. His balance sheet was worthless here. He turned away, his shoulders slumped, and found a place against the far wall, his face hidden in shadow. The storm finally broke after 14 days. One morning, the wind was simply gone. The silence it left behind was absolute, profound. When Cora opened the cabin door, the light that poured in was blinding, a pure, painful white reflected off a world that had been scoured clean. The valley was unrecognizable, a sea of snow, its familiar contours smoothed and softened into alien shapes. The town below was a collection of mounds, only the steepest rooftops visible. From her vantage point, she could see no movement, no life. But her cabin and her cave were full of it. 22 souls had found their way to her door. They had survived on her food, her water, her foresight. Now, they emerged slowly, blinking in the harsh light like creatures born into a new world. There were no speeches. There were no grand apologies. Gratitude was not spoken, it was acted. Davies, the man who had laughed the loudest, picked up a shovel without being asked and began the back-breaking work of clearing a path from her door. He did not look at her. He simply worked, his movements stiff but determined, each shovelful of snow a word he could not speak. Finn went to his buried smithy and began the long process of digging it out, knowing the tools inside would be needed to rebuild everything. Hemlock, the merchant, made his way to what was left of his store. He shoveled the entrance clear and, once inside, declared that any remaining food or supplies were for everyone, his ledger forgotten on its frozen desk. The currency of the valley had changed overnight. It was no longer coin or credit. It was a shovel in the hands of a humbled man, a shared sack of flour, a repaired tool. It was the quiet, necessary work of survival. Cora stood on her porch, Fen sitting faithfully at her side, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against the wood. She watched them work. She watched the first, Thin plumes of smoke began to rise from the town's buried chimneys as people dug out their homes. They were not friends. She was not their savior. She was simply the one who had listened to the wind and watched the squirrels, the one who had believed the truth when it was inconvenient. The snow was deep, and the numbers of the dead would be high. But there was smoke. It was enough. The quiet dignity of her preparation had become their only hope, and in their silent, shared labor, a new, more honest ledger was being written on the blank, white page of the world.